Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. I hope the audio is coming fine. Yeah, audio is coming fine. So today we are going to discuss a paper by a very strange anthropologist who used to research in a university called University of St Andrews in Edinburgh in Scotland, which was the first university of Scotland. It was founded in 1410 CE. And then he wrote paper after paper, book after book, debunking the mainstream dominant narratives in academia in West and in India, which gets its academic knowledge from the West generally, on caste. And then he was quote unquote bullied out of his job, okay? And I'm not saying he was bullied out of his job, it's the headline literally of the Guardian newspaper from 2006. Now you won't find any of his existence in social media. Nowhere will you find his existence. No website mentioning him, none of his papers. You'll have to, of course, look for his papers. But otherwise, his social media persona or profile is nowhere to be found, except he now teaches or does sort of a massage / yoga, which they have called body minding. He runs that sort of a parlor in Spain. That's his sole identity now, because he was bullied out of academia. We can probably guess because of doing these sorts of research. And here my opinion is that he might have been bullied out of doing this sort of research and for breaking the dominant caste narratives in academia, because all that went against his work, went against the let's say the geopolitical interests of the West of those days, and even to this day to some extent, which was always that let's beat down India, Hinduism in some way or the other, because they're a huge part of the funding of anyone in power in the West, mainly US and England, does come from, especially USA, does come from evangelic organizations, and they want conversions to go on in India, and if conversions happen, it's easier to keep India in check in every way. So conversions can't be made that possible or that feasible, that easy, unless the academia, the people in power, the opinion creators in New Delhi, in the biggest universities of the country, always vilify Hinduism, always demonize Hinduism, but especially Brahmins. Now here, he is not saying that casteism never happened, there's no such thing as caste-based oppression or something. He says something else. A bit of that we will find in this paper, which I have not read as of yet, and a bit of that we'll find in another paper, which we are going to discuss pretty soon, probably today or tomorrow, and that is called scapegoating. The exact name is not that, but the paraphrasing would end up being that why are Brahmins the scapegoats, okay? And how, okay? How Brahmins were the scapegoats in a caste-based society, in a society that organizes itself on the basis of caste. So if the Brahmins are not the sole people to blame, if the Brahmins are scapegoat according to him, then of course, and then if these sorts of research becomes the mainstream in liberal arts academia, in sociology, anthropology, then people won't be persuaded to convert, because if your enemy is not Hinduism, why would you convert to Christianity or other religions? I think that's why he might have been bullied out of academia. So let's start now. So this paper is called, "Is a Theory of Caste Still Even Possible?" This is from 1994. So Declan Quigley writes in the abstract that a theory of caste must offer a way of ordering the facts in such a way that it does not diminish the significance of some or ignore others. It must also be comparative. Caste organization is found in some parts of South Asia, but not all. We know it is found in Europe, or more specifically in Japan. Samurais, shoguns, etc. Equally, structural parallels may be found in many other parts. Exactly. Structural parallels may be found in many other parts of the world, and one should not therefore assume that the defining characteristics of caste are unique to Hindu communities or to the ideology of Brahmanism. And this is where he must have pissed off the academic mainstream. What is the Varna status of caste, Boidya, roads, jats, etc.? I have actually wondered about this, because they seem to be varying in different regions in India, and different Varnas in different points of time. Okay, so what I've been told by some sociologist scholars, PhDs, is that you can't really retrofit jatis into Varnas necessarily and not always at all. Okay, so it might be irrelevant almost, the idea of varnas. Varnas is just a cool discussion to have, that yeah, they are of this class, that class, etc. But jati is hard to retrofit in varna in all contexts. That's the thing I'm coming to realize now. I used to always think that caste just meant varna. Then I realized caste means varna and jati. Now I'm realizing caste means only jati and has almost nothing to do with varna. Shel Sharma is saying, have you read Threads of Adi? No, I've not heard of him. Okay, so in 1994, Declan Quigley is starting his abstract by saying that caste is not unique to Hinduism, not to Brahmanism, not to India, etc. Okay. What is needed is a theory which explains why all of the traits associated with caste are found together where and when they are, whether in South Asia or elsewhere. Okay. So his question here, at least for this paper, is that can a theory be made which explains all traits associated with caste and when they are found together? Various theories of caste are reviewed in this chapter before coming to the conclusion that one of these makes much more sense of the historical and ethnographic evidence than the others. Most theories depict castes as arranged in a ladder-like vertical order. Exactly what we were discussing right now, Dark Optimist, that it might not be even about varna and a hierarchical varna always. At least most of the times it isn't actually. Most theories depict castes as arranged in a ladder-like vertical order. Sociologists have tended to emphasize this quote-unquote stratification regarding the ideological and ritual manifestations of caste, such as the pervasive concern with purity and impurity as epiphenomenal. Anthropologists have generally avoided this error but have faced other intractable problems. Okay, so he's saying that sociologists have always said this, but anthropologists may have avoided this particular error, but they have fallen into other traps. Some see caste as a recent colonial artifact, others as an ancient indigenous category. Many are heavily influenced by the ideological reductionism of Dumont's theory of Hindu society. Dumont's theory is what you know as the casteism narratives of mainstream liberal arts academia, okay? And Dumont has been debunked by Nicholas B. Dirks and by this person as well. On the other hand, Dumont's analysis raises so many problems that some have attempted to retreat from theory and restrict their studies to ethnographic description. The argument here is that caste results from an uneasy stalemate between the pull of localized lineage organization and the forces of political, ritual, and economic centralization encapsulated in monarchical institutions. I think this is a very fair thing to say. What do you think, guys? Doesn't this make sense very much? The argument here is that caste results from an... Okay, he's talking about anthropologists, I guess. Let's see. The argument here is that caste results from an uneasy stalemate between the pull of localized lineage organization and the forces of political, ritual, and economic centralization encapsulated in monarchical institutions. Caste systems are the product of a... And it has to be a monarchical institution because today Narendra Modi is Teli caste, Vaishya caste, or is he a Kshatriya because he's leading the country. Caste systems are the product of a certain degree of centralization which involve the organization of ritual and other services around the king and dominant lineages. The central institution is, as Hocart suggested, the monarchy, and not, as Dumont suggested, the Brahman priesthood. The removal of Hindu kings in India with the advent of colonialism does not negate this thesis, because it is a specifically Western view of kingship, which allows for only one monarch within a territory. Kingship and the configurations of castes associated with it was always reproduced at the court of lesser chiefs and is still replicated today in the household of members of dominant castes. This I get very much. This makes sense to me very much. He's saying that it's not just that the king lives like a king and has a structure around him, has a political formation around him like a king. Actually, no, that's not the case. There are little kings everywhere, okay? There's a neighborhood king like a district magistrate or your councillor or MLA, all of whom behave like kings, all of whom pretend to be chief ministers and prime ministers in their local circles, and therefore all of them perform the same, let's say, hierarchical structures, okay, and organizational structures, and even in this case, the rituals. So we are dealing with king-like posts, basically. Dada, do you know Sandesh Khali News? Yeah, why wouldn't I know? And it's still replicated today in the households of members of dominant caste. So let's say local, some elite village headman or local zamindar. In Bengalis would understand when I say Bonedi Badi in a neighborhood. All of them have a system, form a system around them which is like a system that would be created by a king around him. Now, introduction. This is getting already very interesting, juicy. There is a considerable gulf between the ways in which sociologists and anthropologists typically look at caste. Sociologists tend to regard caste in a regrettably truncated fashion as an extreme form of social stratification, which is a kind of sociological opposite of class. Quote, which is open and closed stratification systems are sometimes described by the terms class and caste. End quote. Caste is frequently equated with Hindu social organization through the misleading epithet, the Indian caste system, end quote. Okay, he's saying this is a misleading epithet, guys. This is insane. No wonder he lost his job. Caste is frequently equated with Hindu social organization through the misleading epithet, the Indian caste system. And sociologists usually home in on the fact that where there is caste, quote, an individual's social position is fixed at birth and cannot be changed, end quote. When sociologists use the concept to refer to situations outside of India, this is normally in cases where racial segregation occurs, as in the southern states of the USA following the abolition of slavery, or the more contemporary situation in South Africa, because he's writing this paper in 1994. So when they do find caste-like structures outside, they only equate that they only see such operation in racism. But now, therefore, these people, the intellectual descendants of these sorts of sociologists, have started saying that therefore caste is the same as racism, and maybe even Aryan invasion theory is true. Tab to casteism or racism ek hi hai. What is common to both situations, it is argued, is the cultural insistence on maintaining the quote-unquote purity of certain groups by establishing inviolable boundaries, particularly with reference to intermarriage. Yeah, this would be Suraj Yangre's line of argument. Such a perspective is of limited value. इसका ज़्यादा value नहीं है. In the first place, the kind of ethnic separation, okay, such a perspective is of limited value in the first place. The kind of ethnic separation referred to above normally concerns a very small number of groups, usually 2 or 3, whose opposition to each other is crude and straightforward. In a typical caste system, however, it is not usual for a score or more castes to be bound together in very complex relationships. It is not unusual. In a typical caste system, however, it is not unusual for 20 or more castes to be bound together in very complex relationships. Exactly what Dark Optimistic was saying here, that can they be retrofitted into a varna? Can all jatis be retrofitted into varnas? No, they can't, in fact. Moreover, the kind of ethnic cleansing which we associate with former Yugoslavia is undoubtedly also motivated by a concern for quote-unquote purity, as is the Mediterranean honor and shame complex, but we would never think of describing either as a caste system. Yeah. To characterize caste systems baldly as forms of stratification is also to leave out most of what is really intriguing about them. Namaskar bhai. Do listen to it from the first, okay? You'll find it very interesting. To characterize caste systems baldly as forms of stratification is also to leave out most of what is really intriguing about them. In particular, it tells us nothing about the seemingly endless flow of ritual and ritual prohibitions which preoccupy all members of caste-organized communities in their everyday activities. For example, those revolving around the preparation and consumption of food. Nor does it account for the existence of untouchability, an institution which causes many egalitarian Westerners and increasingly Indians themselves to condemn caste out of hand as a barbarous institution which has no place in the modern world. A further difficulty with the stratification approach is the implication that all castes are arranged one above the other in a relatively unambiguous way like a football league table. Okay, this is weird because Dark Optimistic, the first question he asked and the answer I gave and we discussed is basically what's being repeatedly discussed here as well. See, again, I need to reiterate that you can't retrofit jatis forcibly into varnas. Varnas almost has nothing to do with caste as we know it. So listen to this. A further difficulty with the stratification approach is the implication that all castes are arranged one above the other, which is not the case. He's saying this is implied, that all castes are arranged one above the other in a relatively unambiguous way like a football league table. And no wonder have academics not really solved caste, because they think casteism is always just a horizontal hierarchy, but in fact it might be this way, okay? It's not this way. And therefore, there might be different kinds of oppression that some people from every caste or every jati is doing to someone or the other. Okay? No wonder Ambedkar was angry with Brahmins, but Savarkar pointed out to him that no, even Mahars oppress people who we think are below Mahars. Okay, but it might be a case of below anyway. But of course, respect will be there, but respect might be dependent on how much land we own, or you own, or which is the idea that the caste is just a status group. So respect in that case would be dependent on how much land you own and how valuable is your service to the society. Dark Optimistic is saying some Bengali Kayasthas say they are Kshatriya, some say Vaishya, and some doesn't know. Maybe they were ex-Buddhist who were later reverted. Actually, what I've heard is that academics, the consensus among academics is that Kayasthas encompass all three, Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. But they came from a different place and probably changed their profession at a different time, and hence they are not exactly Kshatriya or exactly Brahmin or exactly Vaishya. This is often coupled with a somewhat distorted view of the two Indian concepts most closely associated with the word caste, namely Varna and Jati. The Varna consists of 4 categories, each ranked differently in terms of social honor. Below these 4 groupings are the untouchables, those in the lowest position of all. The Jati are locally defined groups within which the caste ranks are organized. Those in the highest Varna, the Brahmins, represent the most elevated condition of purity, the untouchables the lowest. But then there are some Brahmins who are looked upon as untouchables by people from the so-called lower Varnas and even lower Jatis. There's a group of Brahmins which we were reading in, I think, Dipankar Gupta's paper, that who are considered untouchable by the non-Brahmins in some region in southern India. Okay, if a Brahmin crosses the road or if he enters the household, after he goes out, Gaumutra is distributed among the place to purify that place because the Brahmin stepped foot in that area. Okay, and then Pirali Brahmins, which is Rabindranath Tagore's caste, as far as I remember. Yeah. And they were considered almost like socially ostracized Brahmins. They were hated among other Brahmins. The untouchables and the lowest. This simple description, while accurately reflecting the most common conceptions of caste, this is a mainstream view. This simple description, while accurately reflecting the most common conceptions of caste both among Hindus and among those who comment on them, contains a number of misrepresentations. In the first place, the concept of Varna refers to 4 basic social functions usually defined as priesthood, kingship, generating wealth, and providing service, and does not refer to kinds of social groupings. Jatis, which are groups based on kinship and marriage, are not subsets of Varnas any more than English people with the surname Smith are a subset of people who work as smiths. Because at some point, someone who did work as Smith might have gotten the surname Smith, but that's almost irrelevant after a few generations because they have no memory of ever being a Smith professionally. Secondly, it is problematic to say that Brahmins are the highest Varna for a number of reasons. Oh my god. Now we will get to understand why he was bullied out of his job, guys. We are getting into dangerous territory. Similarly, it is problematic to say that Brahmins are the highest Varna for a number of reasons. There are thousands of Brahmin castes or jatis whose members continually dispute each other's status. If some of them enjoy greater prestige than others, as they themselves always state, the criterion for this must be something other than the assimilation to the Brahman Varna. Another difficulty is that, exactly what I just discussed, the Pirali Brahmins. Another difficulty is that those Brahmins who are priests are often seen as subordinate to those whose rituals they perform. Right, listen to this. Brahmins who are priests are often seen as subordinate, जिसके लिए रिचुअल किया जा रहा है उसका सबॉर्डिनेट है वो, and whose status they thereby legitimate. Okay, for example, paradigmatically, the kings and landowning nobility who are identified with the Kshatriya Varna, priests are often portrayed as vessels or scapegoats through ritual, take away the sin, evil, and death of their patrons. So in this situation, The Brahmin, in fact, the Purohit, in fact, is in a subordinate position to the king. Parry's work on the Mahabrahmans of Banaras provides one of the best examples of this and is supported by the work of Raheja and Levi, among others. In any case, only a minority of Brahmins actually work as priests, so it is not self-evident that the status of all Brahmins is determined by this particular function, as is often claimed. Only a minority of Brahmins actually work as priests, so it is not self-evident that the status of all Brahmins is determined by this particular function, as is often claimed. Okay, so if at all you are saying that Purohits are superior to everyone just because they are Purohits, first of all, they are not superior to them. Second of all, every Brahmin is not even a Purohit. So how can you use that as a claim to justify saying that Brahmins are superior to everyone? The implication that there is an automatic correspondence between Varna and Jati is also unwarranted, because there is often a certain amount of dispute. Again, the question which we just discussed. Varna and Jati are not corresponding to each other, we are now learning. The implication that there is an automatic correspondence between Varna and Jati is also unwarranted, because there is often a certain amount of dispute about which Varna a particular Jati should be identified with. Exactly what we are discussing in the comment section. This is very coincidental. Parry's representation of the caste hierarchy in Kangra in northwest India is a particularly good illustration of this. Here he says, a number of castes whose Varna is perceived by others as Shudra see themselves as either Kshatriya or Brahman. Such discrepancies between self-representation and representation by others are, I believe, a common feature of caste-organized communities. And the problems coming out of these sorts of descriptions of each other, we have seen such an example in the book called Shakti and Shakta by Sir John Woodruff, where we were discussing Tantra. Remember that Sir John Woodruff was pointing out that a lot of Western academics have said that Tantra is not, or this kind of Tantra or that kind of Tantra is not Vedic or is anti-Vedic or is pre-Vedic, etc. Because they have found some quote describing that this school of Tantra is not Vedic or anti-Vedic. Okay, but Sir John Woodruff points out that let's say Tantra A is being claimed to be anti-Vedic or pre-Vedic or non-Vedic. The claim that is being made about Tantra A is actually being made by its competitor Tantra B. Tantra B's gurus and teachers, their philosophers are saying Tantra A is anti-Vedic, but the academics are with probably evil intentions or mistakenly quoting Tantra B to prove that Tantra A is not Vedic. But that Tantra B is saying that only because they are a competitor of Tantra A, not because Tantra A is actually saying that he is anti-Vedic. When we get into the text of Tantra A themselves, then we see he is saying that no, I'm a descendant of Vedas only, or we have no opposition to Vedas. That sort of a thing is going on here. In short, then, the conventional portrayal of caste, as one might find it in a standard textbook of sociology, or one should add, as one might find it in the accounts of many Hindus themselves, is riddled with problems. Anthropological theories of caste have also run into a number of difficulties, not just sociology. There is widespread agreement that the most important theoretical statement on the subject in recent times has been by Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus. And a glance at any bibliography on caste will immediately reveal that the influence of this book has been unparalleled. That is what we know as the casteism conversations of mainstream liberal arts academia today in India and elsewhere. Yet Dumont's theory has been the focus of sustained criticism for more than a quarter century, to the point where it is no longer clear how much, if any of it remains tenable. But of course, he was also criticizing Dumont and these theories of caste, and he was bullied out of his job. Some anthropologists have tried to sideline the theoretical problems by sticking to what they can actually observe. Some anthropologists have tried to sideline the theoretical problems by sticking to what they can actually observe on the ground during prolonged periods of field work, as if ethnographic description and theoretical abstraction belong to mutually exclusive zones. At a recent internal, because he's saying that ethnographic description and theoretical abstraction do not belong to mutually exclusive groups. They go hand in hand. Ethnographic description and theoretical abstraction. But the researchers who are doing it, they think as if these two are different silos. At a recent international workshop on caste today in 1994, I guess. For example, the implications of recent ethnographic and historical research for the theory of caste were markedly absent from virtually all of the workshop's deliberations, okay? The implications of recent ethnographic and historical research for the theory of caste were markedly absent. Where theory did appear, as in the question of the relation between caste and colonialism, the central issue was not confronted. Some claimed, following the deconstructionist fashion, that caste was a relatively recent colonial artifact derived from the classificatory obsessions of census makers, which is the S.N. Balagangadhara view. Others argued or implied that caste is an ancient Hindu principle enshrined in classical Hindu texts. It cannot, of course, be both, and Quigley is debunking both to some degree. It should be obvious that it is impossible to divorce sociological theory from ethnography and history. Even to introduce the word caste is to imply a particular way of cutting up the world which relies on certain theoretical presuppositions. Yeah. Even to introduce the word caste is to imply a particular way of cutting up the world which relies on certain theoretical presuppositions. More obviously still, if anthropologists working in different regions are to compare their findings, there is no option but to turn to theory. As in the study of any social institution, to be comparative is to be theoretical, and to be theoretical is to be comparative. Why should there be such difficulty in providing a theoretical explanation of caste when an enormous amount of ethnographic and historical evidence on the subject has been produced over the last 40 years or so? He's writing this in 1994, so now 80 years or so. There are, I believe, a number of interrelated reasons for this, which can be summarized as follows. See, these people have been bullied out of their jobs. No wonder I have to call for debunking or defunding sociology. So, Quigley is saying, there are, I believe, a number of interrelated reasons for this, which can be summarized as follows. As follows. So why is there so much difficulty in providing a theoretical explanation of caste? First reason. Most theories of caste appear to involve an unjustifiably arbitrary selection of evidence, since it appears to many that it is the facts themselves which are inconsistent. A common approach has been to ignore those elements which are awkward and to present the allegedly overwhelming picture suggested by those facts which are retained. The objection to this is that the awkward facts still remain, even if they are hidden. While Dumont's Homo hierarchicus has been criticized endlessly, many continue to argue or imply that his basic premises are undeniable, given the difficulty of constructing an alternative theory using the same premises, okay? Given the difficulty of constructing an alternative theory using the same premises, or of finding alternative premises from which to begin, the majority of recent commentators on caste have preferred to concentrate on particularistic historical or ethnographic studies, okay? Particularistic historical or ethnographic studies. However, the retreat from theory has not been any less problematic since whatever is presented, some selection or prioritization of material is inevitable, right? Obviously, because it's after all not God doing it. Whatever is presented, some selection or prioritizing of material is inevitable. It is impossible to write about caste without betraying an endorsement of one theoretical position or other. Therefore, probably one of the reasons that there has been so much difficulty in providing a theoretical explanation of caste. Number 3, why such a lack of theory? The claim is often made that caste is unique to either India or Hinduism, thus making comparison with other social forms elsewhere difficult, if not altogether undesirable, and which is in fact a lie. Caste is seen by some as being quintessentially a traditionally village phenomenon. This is reason 4, okay? Caste is seen by some as being quintessentially a traditionally village phenomenon, while others see it as a colonial invention. Okay, this is the sort of the fight between anti-casteist Western academics versus S.N. Balagangadhara or Jacob de Roover, etc. Caste is seen by some as being quintessentially a traditionally village phenomenon, while others see it as a colonial invention, which exists more in the minds and classificatory needs of imperialist foreigners than it does as an ethnographic or historical reality. Apart from being mutually contradictory, both of these perspectives are too limited in their purview to provide an adequate explanation of the range of phenomena which are associated with caste. This is very well said. As we know that a lot of us may be opposed to the using of the word caste, because the using of the word caste does exactly this. It gives it a distinct Indian or Hindu hue, but that does not eliminate the possibility that again today someone who considers themselves a higher caste pees in the mouth of a lower caste, right? So where is the solution going to come out of then? I think I'm getting more and more respect for Declan Quigley as I go on reading this. The remainder of this article will explore these problems. I will argue that a consistent theory of caste is not as elusive. I will argue that a consistent theory of caste is not as elusive as it has often been made to appear, and that the difficulty is not with the facts but in finding a way of ordering them which does not diminish the significance of some or ignore other facts. Great. Discarded theories of caste. Let's see. Before coming to Dumont's theory of caste, which deserves special consideration, let me briefly mention 4 other approaches to the subject which should be rejected. 4 other approaches which also should be rejected according to him. In fact, all of them have been dismissed many times before, but they have an sorry to interrupt myself, but sorry to cut your flow of listening, but let me explain to you why I am equating S.N. Balagangadhara line of thinking with the colonial view of caste, like the Dumont view of caste, because what we have seen so far from Western academics and the liberal arts Marxist academia is that in the end they have not really solved caste or caste-based bad behavior, right? Because they have nitpicked data. So in the same way, if we are dishonest and nitpick data or use frameworks which ignore a lot of problems that even go on today, if you keep saying that no, don't use the word caste for this, there's no oppression or there's no bad behavior going on, then also in the end we will end up not solving the problem. So let's see if Declan Quigley in fact gives us a better way to look at this. Before coming to Dumont's theory of caste, which deserves special consideration, let me briefly mention 4 other approaches to the subject which should be rejected. In fact, all of them have been dismissed many times before, but they have an insidious way of resurfacing, and 2 of them are still in popular circulation. By popular, quote unquote, I mean both in minds of many who practice caste and in the minds of many of those who study them. The first theory of which we can dispense with is that caste is a product of race. Ore bhai, Rajput Aryanendra, we are going to discuss you now. And we have discussed this in the paper where the professor Jesus Garza, of which university I don't remember, he was debunking, he was showing how even Ambedkar had debunked this Aryan invasion theory and race-based differentiation of caste. So he's also going to debunk that now, quickly. The first theory which we can dispense with is that caste is a product of race, although an important qualification must be added before we throw out the idea altogether, because it's in 1994, he probably was not aware that Aryan invasion theory is complete hokum. The connection between caste and race was made by some of the earliest outside commentators on India who related it to the Aryan invasion of India and to the fact that members of Brahman castes were often light-skinned, while members of peasant and low castes were often dark-skinned or displayed other aboriginal traits. Desai Deepak is Brahmin. Mamta Banerjee is Brahmin. There is some basis in reality for this observation, but it is of limited value for an explanation of caste. Okay, great. This is the sort of the Savarkar line of thinking that, yeah, even if Aryan invasion theory happened, it's of no relevance today. Over the centuries, certain populations were undoubtedly subjugated by others, and the historical remnants of this can still be seen clearly in many places. But for the most part, there is no obvious connection between caste and racial characteristics, and in any case, the complexity of caste systems cannot be explained by a marker as crude as race. So well said. So the often made comparison with racial segregation does not explain why one should need such a plethora of castes in any locality. Okay, अगर सिर्फ गोरे चमड़े और काले चमड़े का डिफरेंस है तो इतने सारे कास्ट का है चाहिए. तो दिस पेपर वुड ऑल्सो बी डिबंकिंग सूरज यंगड़े's views. The second theory, though false, is still widely believed. Let's see what it is. This is the idea that there is an inherent connection between caste and occupation, which explains how caste systems work in general. Okay. This, in fact, a lot of trads would argue that वो occupation का संस्कृत क्या था? जीविका. Jivika does not necessarily denote caste. That's what even Quigley is saying. Interesting. Let's see. The idea that there is an inherent connection between caste and occupation, which explains how caste systems work in general. There are two reasons why this connection is not a sufficiently good guide. The first is that it is never the case that all members of a given caste perform a particular occupation. A very common situation is that a particular caste is associated with a particular occupation, for example, being a priest or barber or potter, but that many, perhaps even all members of the caste are agricultural laborers as well, or work in nearby towns as clerks or rickshaw drivers or whatever, or are employed by the military in some more or less distant garrison. So while a couple may be referred to as Mr. and Mrs. Potter, that is, they are designated as members of the local Potter caste, they may in fact have never made a pot in their lives. This is a very respectable exercise in honesty, because if you don't debunk all presuppositions and bullshit assumptions, then you will go nowhere with the research and only do propaganda. This will not deter others from saying about them that, quote, our sons cannot marry their daughters because they are potters and we are tailors, for example, even though the tailors in question have never sewn cloth, but are in fact minor civil servants in a local government office, or members of a musical band performing Hindi film music at weddings and other social occasions. Yeah, maybe the potter has not done actual pottery, nor has the tailor done actual tailoring, but both of them have some amount of disliking for each other for whatever their ancestors were in what professions. Okay. And by extension, the same statement will be made by members of other castes. The general principle then is that a Mr. Potter need not be a potter, a Mr. Brahman need not be a priest, and so on. Very well said. सर बंगाल की कंडीशन के बारे में बताओ. बंगाल का कंडीशन तो है गड्ढे में. See, let's take a sort of a break from this topic. Kolkata has never been run, Kolkata as we know it, unless it was a prehistoric medieval village. Kolkata since its birth has never been ruled by Hinduism. Okay. Mamata Banerjee is the first Hindu to be the head of Kolkata and therefore West Bengal, but it has never been run by Hindus. Okay, Mamata Banerjee is of course a devout Hindu. Trinamool party is a party full of devout Hindus, but their thinking is not very Hindu-like as we can see. So therefore you see this entire opinion-making strata or the socioeconomic group of Kolkata who are very anti-Hindu or basically unknowingly anti-Hindu. They will always be a problem, because who have ruled Kolkata? First it was British, then it was the Brahmo Congress complex. Okay, all the Congress supporters were basically Brahmos, the elite elite Bengalis of 19th and 20th century. Okay, of North Kolkata. Then it was communists. Now it's Mamata Banerjee, who is at least Hindu, and people the Trinamool party workers supporters are all devout Hindus. Their illegitimate mills are all named after gods. All the councillors donate heavily to local temples, etc. But their behavior, thinking, in action is not Hindu. They just play Hindu, okay? This is my main disagreement with Jesai Deepak. I think he does not get when it comes to Bengal. Jesai Deepak always, this is my one significant disagreement with Jesai Deepak. He says that wear your religious symbols proudly, or be as Hindu as possible, follow customs, traditions, rituals, etc. I think he's saying that from a very South Indian perspective, where people are not being Hindu or being too atheist around him, or at least the people he's seeing around him, and therefore he is making the equation that a person who is wearing Western clothes, consuming Western media, and therefore ending up believing in Western propaganda. That's not the case in Bengal. In Bengal, all the voters of Trinamool are devout Hindus. A huge chunk of CPM's voters have always been devout Hindus, but it has not actually gained any fruit for Hinduism, okay? or in good behavior, decent humanitarian behavior even, okay? So after Trinamool someday goes out of power, then maybe we can hope to have finally a Hindu ethos coming into the power structures of Bengal, which has not happened so far, never in the history of Kolkata. But I wonder if it's going to happen anytime soon, because the Sandesh Khali protests were going on pretty strongly, but as you see, the intellectuals still have not changed their mind and still have not joined the bandwagon against Trinamool. Unless they change their mind, it's not going to happen. And today, Mamata Banerjee sent, they sent yesterday, a lot of police have been sent, and all the police are going around doing groundwork as like politicians and talking to all villagers and saying that, yes, now we will solve all your problems. So first of all, if that convinces the villagers, therefore then Trinamool is not going to go away. Or if the footages of these situations also is picked up by the intellectuals, then also they are not going to change their minds, and therefore Trinamool is going to again remain in power for the foreseeable future. And for those of you who are asking always everywhere on all social media that why are the Bhadraloks quiet? Well, the Bhadraloks are quiet because they are not jobless. Bhadraloks have professions that are very much related to Tollywood and Trinamool Congress. So they need to be sure that Trinamool is going, then they will get job. When BJP comes to power, then they'll change their mind, not before that. Okay. Now we get into this paper. Now we resume. So while a couple may be referred to, Mr. Potter, maybe Mr. Brahmin not to be a priest, and so on. Okay. The general principle then is that a Mr. Potter need not be a potter, a Mr. Brahmin need not be a priest, and so on. The second reason why the correspondence between caste and occupation is a poor guide to the working of caste is that many people who perform the same occupation belong to quite distinct castes. This is particularly obvious with relation to two classes of work, agricultural labor and the priesthood. Given that the vast majority of the population of the Indian subcontinent work on the land but are divided into thousands of castes, it is obvious that this occupation does not by itself provide a very clear indicator of caste membership. Listen to this. This is very, very tricky now. Second reason why the correspondence between caste and occupation is a poor guide to the working of caste is that many people who perform the same occupation belong to quite distinct castes. This is particularly obvious with relation to two classes of work, agricultural labor and priesthood. Given that the vast majority of the population of the Indian subcontinent work on the land but are divided into thousands of castes, it is obvious that this occupation does not by itself provide a very clear indicator of caste membership. It is also evident that many groups perform priestly activities but see themselves as completely separate from each other and different in caste status. Lol. So it's all about statusism and status groups, guys. In fact, it is quite common for some priestly groups to regard quite common for some priestly groups to regard others performing ritual activities as kinds of untouchables, which we discussed in the beginning of the live stream. A third theory which runs into difficulties is favored by some comparative sociologists. This now the third theory. This revolves around the idea that caste is fundamentally about dominance and exploitation, and any talk of pollution concepts as a criterion for distinguishing between castes is merely ideological obfuscation. On this argument, Brahmins are at the top and untouchables are at the bottom, not because of their respective degrees of purity, but because of their respective degrees of material or economic power. Yeah. Which we also discussed in the beginning, that in the end, that sort of social respect will depend on whether you own land or not. Let's see if that's correct or not. The work of Gerald Behrman is one of the best examples of this kind of argument, though there is a similar, if more subtle, version in the writings of the Indian sociologist Andre Bittel. The reason that this explanation does not hold is simply that economic power and ritual status do not always coincide. There are Brahman castes whose members are very poor, and there are castes which are seen as low or even untouchable, whose members are in fact quite wealthy in comparison with the rest of the population. Exactly. तो अब तो ऑपरेशन कहाँ पे हुआ, और ऑपरेशन कैसे हो सकता है? एक गरीब भिखारी ब्राह्मण कोई अमीर लोअर कास्ट को जाके मुंह पे थूक सकता है क्या? How is that even possible? So in the end, we are only repeatedly going on talking about status-based bad behavior and not really caste-based behavior, where caste has in fact corresponded to status, then it's of course caste-based, status-based bad behavior, but it's not necessarily so. There also frequently appears to be some kind of inbuilt mechanism which inhibits any easy conversion of acquired wealth into higher caste status. Against this, it must be said that conquering groups always enter a local caste system with Kshatriya or kingly status, even if they were previously regarded as barbarians or outside the pale of the local caste system altogether. So that might explain the Kayastha caste in Bengal. Perhaps the strongest argument against the idea that there is a straightforward correspondence between caste status and economic position is that if this were so, it is doubtful if we would notice anything distinctive about caste systems or have any reason for using the word caste in the first place. Then we would simply call it economic status, isn't it? Why then were anyone interested in using the word caste if it was not just economic status? So the argument that caste is distinct to India and Hinduism, but also it's not just about power based on any magic or economics. They kind of cancel out each other. A fourth theory which has little to recommend, it is the kind of argument advanced by E.R. Leach in an essay entitled "What Do We Mean by Caste?" Great question. That is what we are wondering. Abhay is saying just by being politically or religiously Hindu and ignoring family, community, and occupational will lead to wokeism like the West. We need to be socially Hindu too, as Ankit Shah says it. Yes. But Dada, according to data, upper castes are richer than SC/STs. I am playing devil's advocate. Yeah, that is true. Because they did gain positions of power, how did they gain those positions of power? Because they were of a higher status. How did they get that higher status? Because of actually the land that they had. So the upper castes who did not in fact have lands, they did not become richer than Dalits. For example, my Shah surname, people who faced partition, people who came here dirt poor, we don't have any reservation, scheduled caste certificate, etc. And we came insanely poor. So, and we were never landowners, and we are theoretically upper caste because it's the third varna, Vaishya. So it's what you're looking at is descendants of people who had land and therefore got the respect of British and collaborated with them and therefore maintained their wealth. That's all. So what do we mean by caste? Leach argued that in caste systems, every group has its place and the element of competition among them had been largely removed. Leach argued that in caste systems, every group has its place and the element of competition among them has been largely removed, resulting in harmonious integrated systems. While caste systems are often well integrated, this does not mean that competition for status is lacking. Yeah, why would competition for status ever lack? On the contrary, the institution of hypergamy in North India, which is widespread among landowning castes, is nothing other than a competitive marriage strategy where the goal is to improve one's status at the expense of others. Other examples of refusing to accept one's place include the construction of false genealogies, name changing in order to make it appear that one really belongs to a higher caste, moving to another locality in order to assume a new identity, and conversion from Hinduism to Christianity and Buddhism. Okay, these are the things we have learned from Deepankar Gupta and Hitesh Ranjan Sannal's paper as well, which was rampant. People just randomly came up with new caste names or paid some Brahmins to declare them higher castes. In short, the idea that castes always meekly accepted their status position is unfounded because, yeah, obviously, why would someone accept that, yes, I'm lower caste, bhai, thank you. Only reason that would happen is if they are not landowners. And the day they somehow manage to get land by doing business with some benevolent upper caste or some crime or some charisma, business based on charisma, where he's allowed to do that in fact, the day that happens, the day that person becomes richer, that's the day he jumps caste and goes up and starts saying either I have always been from a higher caste or that now I'm going to oppress the other caste as well. What remains of Dumont's theory of caste then? Another argument against seeing caste as a form of social stratification is that this perspective smuggles in a modern individualistic Western quote-unquote Another argument against seeing caste as a form of social stratification is that this perspective smuggles in a modern individualistic Western set of values which is inappropriate, where traditional holistic values prevail. No wonder he lost his job. This is one element of Dumont's position which seeks to restore the indigenous values of caste. This is one element of Dumont's position which seeks to restore the indigenous values of caste to their rightful place. Dumont claims that two oppositions form the ideological basis of caste. The first of these is purity and impurity, which he argues is manifested most clearly in the location of Brahmins and untouchables, respectively, at opposite poles of the caste system. The second opposition is between ritual status and secular power and like the economic status, etc., or whatever say they have in society. Ritual status and secular power, and this shows itself, he states, most clearly in the respective positions of the Brahman and Kshatriya Varnas in the ancient Vedic texts, or in the respective positions of priest and king, or priestly caste and dominant caste on the ground. There is, says Dumont, an ideological disjunction such that power is subordinated to status, the king is subordinated to the priest, because it is through religious values that the whole system gains its meaning, and the Brahman priest is the repository of these values. This is Dumont's idea. This is going to be debunked by Quigley. At first sight, this way of looking at things seems appealing because it appears to account for the quote-unquote fact that Brahmins are the highest caste. However, on closer inspection, the concept of Brahmins being supreme because of their superior purity is difficult to sustain. As I have already mentioned, there is a widely held belief that priesthood is a defiling activity. The idea being that through rituals which are performed for a patron, like the person hiring the priest, rituals which are performed through rituals which are performed for a patron, the officiant, the person officiating that ritual, takes away the patron's impurities, leaving the patron pure, at least momentarily. Okay, कि अगर मैंने हायर किया एक पुरोहित को कोई प्योरीफाइंग यज्ञ करने के लिए, उससे मैं प्योर हो गया. Therefore, he is saying, therefore, the act of the Brahmin is kind of a defiling activity because he is taking away the impurity of his patron. The fact of there being many different kinds of priests, not all of whom are Brahman by caste, presents another problem. Men of barbar caste, for example, often perform ritual activities for lower castes, which are strictly analogous to those performed by Brahmins for higher castes. Okay, in exactly the same way, which we were discussing, that little kings behave like big kings. Your local neta behaves like he is Narendra Modi in his locality. In Bengali, there's a famous saying called Bon Gaye Sheyal Raja. In a small village, even the wolf behaves like a lion. And as Raheja has pointed out, affines are sometimes called to perform priestly duties when a Brahmin cannot be found. So it's not that only a Brahmin priest is doing, at least when he was researching, is going around doing the priestly activities for lower castes. According to race caste theory, Bengali Dravidians are right to say that Sri Krishna was a Mool Nivasi, but then Mamata Banerjee is an outsider. Aryan Mamata Banerjee. Perform priestly duties. Most intriguingly, there is a category of Brahmins in North India referred to as Maha-Brahmins, literally great Brahmins, whose function is to perform funerary rituals. This is a particularly despised group. Okay, they are hated because they are seen as being permanently defiled by the death pollution they take on themselves. The problem for a theory of caste, which would have Brahmins at one pole and untouchables at the other, is that the Maha-Brahmins are seen as both at the same time. Maha-Brahmins are seen as pure because they are Brahmins, and also untouchable as a Brahman because they are doing untouchable jobs or defiling dirty works. They are taking the vileness or ashubhness of death upon themselves. Their ethnographers tend to dispel the ambiguity by arbitrarily assigning them either very high or very low status, but this really amounts to a sleight of hand because they are in fact ambiguous. They are in fact all tangled up. It's a clusterfuck. Moreover, the same apparent paradox applies in a much more understated way, I would argue, to the members of all those castes, whether Brahman or other, who work as priests. It is no coincidence that Brahmins who follow some profession other than priesthood widely regard themselves as superior in caste status to Brahmins who function as priests. Interesting. Is that the case? I don't know about this much. Any Brahmin here? Can you all confirm? Maybe you don't believe in it in yourself, but do you know that your family or people around you think this way? That Purohit Brahmins are actually a bit lower than Brahmins who are into other professions. Dumo's opposition between pure and impure, which he equates with the opposition between Brahman and untouchable, is then suspect. Though there is no denying that Hindus are constantly preoccupied with pollution concerns, and this must be explained. What of Dumo's other opposition between status and power, or between priest and king? The main difficulty with this concept is that it only works at the level of ideology. And then only if one is extremely selective and listens to certain voices and not others, only then this Dumo's theory is plausible. Dumo's thesis depends primarily on the idea that, quote, power in India became secular at a very early date, end quote, but this is simply not sustained by the evidence, whether from texts or from ethnography. I see. Kings always retained a central position in the rituals they patronized, and their functions were replicated on a lesser scale by the well-to-do members of dominant castes, a situation which has not changed with the collapse of Hindu kingship in the face of colonialism, which we were discussing, little kings. The argument has been put succinctly by Raheja, quote, kingship no longer exists, but it has been perhaps replaced by the ritual centrality of the dominant caste, as it has been described in the Pahangshu village of her fieldwork ethnography, Pahangshu ethnography, and we know this is very common in every village. In every village there will be one dominant caste or one family who is dominant because of being from a dominant caste, at least. There, as in many of the textual traditions of kingship, the Brahman is hierarchically superior, yet the dominant landholding caste stands at the center of a complex ritual organization that permeates nearly every aspect of the everyday life of the village. Okay, so basically the king was dictating everything. Okay, he may be theologically below Brahmins. In practice, that's never the case. How would he be? How would that ever be the case? Dumo is well aware that it's sort of like the position of the president of India today, isn't it? In theory, she might be above Narendra Modi, but we know what's the truth. Dumo is well aware that this theory does not apply to the observable facts on the ground. In theory, power is ultimately subordinate to priesthood, whereas in fact priesthood submits to power, obviously, yeah. But the solution to this apparent contradiction, Dumo insists, is to understand caste as a structure of ideas, not as something which can be grasped by looking at particular territories. The difficulty with this argument is that Dumo is simultaneously asking us to consider an actual place, India, which exists in space and time. We are asked to be empirical when it suits his theory, and something less than empirical when the facts appear to contradict it. Oh my god, now you understand why he lost his job. In spite of these difficulties, there is a legacy from Dumo's theory which students of caste ignore at their peril, and some recent alternative interpretations of caste, such as those of Class, Hall and Beichler, are seriously flawed in this regard. Among the most important of Dumo's ideas are the following. The holism of caste systems is in direct contrast to the individualism, which is the dominant ideology of the modern West. Okay. Amongst the most important of Dumo's ideas. One cannot talk about castes in isolation, only in relation to other castes. This means that one must have some kind of theory of a system of relations. Also, since this system is repeatedly found in a very large number of localities, there must be an underlying structure which gives rise to this. The relation between priest and king, or priests and dominant castes, is central. The connections between priesthood, purity and impurity are also central. Given the endogamous character of castes, the role of kinship, okay, not kingship, kin, family. Given the endogamous character of castes, the role of kinship and marriage obviously require careful attention. The basic elements of caste organization. क्रिस्टोफ जाफरलो पे पर वीडियो बनाएगा बोला था, कब आएगा? Are you talking about any paper of his or any particular video of his which you want me to debunk, or is it that entire ideas of Jaffrello that we are going to counter? The basic elements of caste organization. Perhaps the most widespread idea of all about caste is that It is exclusive to Hinduism, and this is why it is found only in India or in places where Hinduism has or Hindus have migrated. This idea is impossible to counter if, following Weber, caste is defined in terms of one's position relative to Brahmins. But virtually all of the institutions which one associates with caste are found in different degrees in other societies at different periods of history. The most obvious of these are recruitment to one's social position at birth, kinship organization in terms of lineages, differentiation between noble or kingly lineages versus others, obviously, endogamy such that marriage tends to be within a restricted group of lineages, obviously, everywhere, pervasiveness of ritual as a mechanism for structuring social relations, pollution concepts which place an ideological stress on the purity of women or of lineages, or the or the purity of kings, or the purity of even priests. Monarchical institutions, whether material, which is palace complexes, monuments to kings, royal deities, etc., and social institutions like courtly lineages and royal retainers, etc., or ideological institutions, royal rituals, chronicles, etc. All of these are observable across the world in different places where caste is not accused of existing, but in fact they exist. And untouchability and scapegoatism. One group will be the scapegoat. To explain caste is to explain why and when all of these traits are found together, when only some of them are found elsewhere. To begin with, the premise that all of the defining characteristics of caste are unique to India or Hinduism, as has been far too uncritically accepted from at least Max Weber onwards, is to be much too selective in deciding what it is that defines caste, and to deny the possibility of any kind of fruitful positive comparison with other places and other areas, other eras even. Even if one were to avoid groups which have converted from Hinduism for political reason, one could still find South Asians who practice caste but profess a different religious identity. Muslims in Pakistan, like their Biradri, which is their caste, or Buddhists in Nepal, for example. One must also recognize that there are, and Buddhism has casteism itself. Even caste-based discrimination is talked of in Buddhist texts, which we have discussed in a live stream long back. One must also recognize that there are Hindus who argue that caste is not part of their religion, and there are Hindus who claim to have nothing to do with caste but who clearly maintain its existence, for instance, by refusing to eat or intermarry with people they deem beneath them. Recently, Andre Betel has argued that the Indian urban middle classes are moving away from caste. This is in 91-92, okay, just when liberalization has happened. Indian urban middle classes are moving away from caste, and that family is becoming the more important institution. Apart from the fact that he presents virtually no evidence for this claim, it is clear that there are still limits to who is regarded as an acceptable marriage partner. Yeah, 90s mein to waisa tha hi. By and large, Betel seems to be referring to the intermarriage of members of Brahman and dominant castes, which formerly would have been separated territorially and politically, but now find themselves thrown together in all of the institutions of a modern state. क्योंकि काम के लिए जाना पड़ रहा है, हर जगह में एक साथ रहना पड़ रहा है. While the barriers to intermarriage may be coming down among these groups, this does not mean that they will marry into other castes which they continue to regard as inferior. In any case, to say that family is now becoming more important is not of itself to indicate any sea change, since family pedigree is precisely what caste has always been about. As Hocart put it, quote, castes are merely families to whom various offices in the ritual are assigned by heredity, end quote. I will return to this idea below. It is obvious that caste continues to play a significant role in the contemporary political arena, but among educated people, this is widely seen as shameful and completely inappropriate in a modern democratic state. Betel argues that it may safely be assumed that in India today, everyone is prepared to speak publicly in support of equality, but none in support of hierarchy or inequality. Obviously, this is in the early 90s. This conclusion flies in the face of a huge body of recent ethnographic material. While it is undoubtedly correct to point out that there is an increasing distaste for the values of caste among the educated middle class, the institution itself does not appear to be in decline. In the last 2 decades alone, scores of ethnographies from all over South Asia have made clear that caste continues to be the bedrock of social organization for hundreds of millions of people. While there is perhaps increasing ambiguity surrounding the ideology of caste, and then of course politics incentivized casteism, while there is perhaps increasing ambiguity surrounding the ideology of caste, it would appear that inequality, far from being regarded as invidious, continues to be seen pervasively as normal, inevitable, even natural, quote unquote natural, like Aryan Putra here. This is not to deny that there have been significant changes in the ways in which caste manifests itself during the last century. For example, where caste blocks appear today, uniting previously disparate groups, this is a modern development which would have been inconceivable in the not very distant past. A good illustration of this is found in the mass conversions to Buddhism stimulated by Gandhi's contemporary and rival Ambedkar. Himself an untouchable, Ambedkar sought to raise the status of other outcasts by breaking their attachment to Hinduism. But this could never have been achieved without the apparatus of modern communication, transport networks, and education, the bases of which were laid down during the period of colonial rule. And it could not have happened if the British had not decapitated the myriad local systems of political allegiances which underpinned pre-colonial caste systems by establishing new foci of political legitimacy and identity. Given the opportunities to organize collectively, untouchables and others did so with a vengeance. It is not that they lacked the will to improve their position under the old regime, but more often than not, political and economic structures deprived them of the means, primarily literacy and mobility. This does not, however, mean that caste is paradigmatically a product of the traditional Indian village. One of the most entrenched fallacies in the literature on caste, this notion stems from a distorted colonial view of India as a land of village republics, and from the fact that most detailed ethnographic work on caste has been done on village communities which are of manageable size for a field researcher working alone. उसकी वजह से सिर्फ village करते हैं लोग. The mistake has been fueled by a frequent failure to consider the historical and ideological relationship between village and town, grama and nagara. The former being, the grama being literally a reflection of the latter. In an article which draws attention to this mirroring quality से I think ये बोला जा रहा है कि वो एस्पिरेशनल मॉडल कॉपी करने का जो टेंडेंसी है वही होगा. लिटिल किंग्स. In an article which draws attention to this mirroring quality, Pocock argues that both in theory and in fact, the traditional Indian city stands for completeness. It is a microcosm of the cosmos and provides the most complete expression of moral values and social order because it is the locus of maximum caste activity. It is also the place where the king is to be found, Nagara, the main function of the king being the maintenance of caste order, quote unquote. Rowe echoes this when he writes that, quote, the distinguishing mark of a town or city in the ancient texts was that only there did one find all the castes resident. The founder of a village or petty kingdom of several villages fulfilled the same role but on a minor scale. Simulation, okay? Simulated small miniature village or miniature kingdom. And the village socio-economic system reflects the arrangements of the city on a lesser scale. So village वाले basically नगर खेल रहे हैं. Perhaps the best extant examples of this connection between caste and pre-industrial urbanism are to be found in the social organization of the Newars of the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal, the seat of a complex urban civilization for more than a millennium. One reason for this is that the quote-unquote valley, in reality a circular bowl surrounded by Himalayan foothills, is extremely fertile, and while the majority of the population have traditionally been agriculturalists, the area has always been capable of supporting a large population, many of whom could be engaged in occupations other than producing food. As a gateway between India and Tibet, the strategic location of the Kathmandu Valley also made it an important trading center. Over the centuries, the combined wealth of commerce and agriculture was converted into impressive temple, palace, and domestic architecture, as well as being channeled into the competitive patronage of ritual, which required a plethora of religious specialists. Moreover, unlike India, Nepal was never colonized by either the Muslims or the British. In the small city kingdoms of the Kathmandu Valley, caste has flourished for centuries among both Hindus and Mahayana Buddhists, with Hinduism, as Gellner observes, being the religion of the rulers. The rulers were usually Hindu, the people were usually, or sometimes, Mahayana Buddhists. While there is not space in this short article to give even a potted description of the complex history and sociology of the Kathmandu Valley, one can point to some of the main features which underpin its caste organization. These same features are, I believe, at the basis of caste everywhere, even if not always in such a clear or complete form. These same features are, I believe, at the basis of caste everywhere, even if not always in such a clear or complete form. In description of caste organization, in any description of caste organization must rest on two preliminary observations. The first is that to be a member of a caste, one must first be a member of lineage, for it is groups of lineages which we recognize as castes by their agreement or refusal to interdine, so beti bandi, roti bandi, or perform certain rituals together. The second observation is that caste systems are only possible given a certain measure of territorial centralization in regions which are capable of sustaining a complex form of social organization. River basins and other fertile areas are typical. One does not normally find caste systems in deserts or high mountains, and it is no accident that in Nepal, for example, caste organization typically evaporates at approximately 4,000 6,000 feet above sea level, where the land becomes aggressively infertile and populations begin to depend on pastoralism to augment their meager agricultural resources. Interesting. Caste systems are only possible when there is a certain measure of territorial centralization in regions which are capable of sustaining a complex form of social organization, like river basins and other fertile areas are right. जबकि equally जहाँ पे लोग बहुत ही oppressed होंगे because of the nature, because of प्रकृति, वहाँ पे हायरार्की, सेपरेशन ऑफ लेबर का कोई चक्कर नहीं है. सब मिलके कुछ भी तरह से खाओ, मार पीट करो और जिंदा रहो. No wonder the Abrahamic faiths are obsessed with equality, because they were born in a desert. Abhay is saying, Dada, you should read the other side as well. People who consider caste as uniquely Hindu. Great, good idea. We will discuss Dumo's arguments as well someday. Caste, I would argue, results from a kind of uneasy stalemate. On the one hand, there is the pull of the lineage, institutionalized in the various ways in which lineage members exert control over one another by restricting marriage choices in the observance of periods of mourning when fellow lineage members die, by taking part in each other's life cycle rituals, marriage, caste initiation, and so on, and through periodic collective worship of lineage deities. So, Kul Devtas. On the other hand, there are the forces of economic, political, and ritual centralization. Encapsulated in monarchical institutions. Among these, the most striking are the often spectacular palace temple complexes and rituals such as Dasai, which are traditionally linked to royal power. This is a very, probably the most important festival of Nepal. The most striking are the often spectacular palace temple complexes and rituals such as Dasai, which are traditionally linked to royal power and which provide a means by which lineage and caste divisions can be transcended as communities come together in common devotion and celebration. If lineage principles were so strong as to inhibit any kind of developed centralization, if lineage principles were so strong as to inhibit any kind of developed centralization, as in the paradigmatic forms of segmentary organization, then clearly caste could not take root, if that was so, then caste could not take root, since it depends on a complex division of labor which must be based on something other than kinship. But on the contrary, if centralization were to be effective, that recruitment for the performance of various social functions was always based on principles other than kinship, other than family, then obviously caste could not flourish either. The weakening of caste among urban professionals in modern India, reported by Betil, though exaggerated, certainly indicates this. I have already pointed out some of the dangers in representing the order of castes in any local caste system as an unambiguous perpendicular ladder with Brahmins at the top, untouchables at the bottom, but in fact it is horizontal. Many of the difficulties in constructing an adequate form of caste. This paper is good. Many of the difficulties in constructing an adequate theory of caste seem to me to be the result of being imprisoned by this ladder-like representation, which one is led to almost inescapably. If one starts with the notion that every caste can be said to be higher or lower than every other caste. We got so many answers from this paper and this particular sentence, guys. this is the problem with the caste debate, right? So many commies are saying this caste is lower, this caste is higher, this is oppressing that lower caste. So many anti-commies and some trads or some Balagangadhara lineage anti-caste people, Hindutva anti-caste people are saying that no, in fact you see this lower caste is oppressing someone else, or is even not being oppressed by that higher caste somewhere else. So in fact, we have to get away from this idea that someone is higher or lower. Higher or lower only comes when one person is landowner and when the other person is not a landowner or rich, etc. But in theory, it's all horizontal mostly. I keep using the wrong word for horizontal, vertical, etc. Okay, I forgot which is this and which is this. Many of the difficulties in constructing an adequate theory of caste seems to me to be the result of being imprisoned by this ladder-like representation which one is led to almost inescapably if one starts with the notion that every caste can be said to be higher or lower than every other caste. You can't retrofit jati into varna. Now I have gotten my answer. I had this discussion with two sociology PhDs just a few weeks back. They said this, and I had some questions in my head that how can that be? I've never heard of this argument. This is in fact backed up by full theoretical evidence by Declan Quigley here. Varnas can't be forcibly fit into the ideas. Jatis can't be forcibly fit into the concept of varnas, guys. I'm not doing that anymore. An alternative representation which does not give rise to this problem focuses rather on the fact that caste systems are relatively centralized forms of political organization. Figure 1 gives a simplified model of this. Let's see what's figure 1. The general structure of caste systems. The king or the dominant caste, the other castes, the general structure of caste systems. This model is of course grossly simplified, and particularly in two respects. Firstly, it is not only dominant caste households which are able to attach other castes to themselves. To a greater or lesser extent, households in every caste will attempt to replicate this pattern by using their resources to employ members of other castes, or sometimes other usually affinally related lineages within the same caste, to perform various services for them. Okay, you got this? Again, that idea that everyone is emulating the king, behaving like a king. So the village is emulating the city, the local neighborhood is emulating the larger village or the kingdom, etc. But every caste is emulating the whichever caste is considered higher or respectable. And in fact, therefore, regardless of them being lower or higher, they are organizing all the other castes around them. Okay, so it's much more complex than we thought. In general, we can always see that the caste conversations we are having about the specific caste, all that is surrounded around the king. Okay, but when it comes to all the other castes as well, in different villages where there is no direct involvement of the king, there also it's working in the same way, where the dominant local caste is working like the king, and he in terms of the relationship between all these castes are based on different works, services and professions, and therefore it again ends up becoming same as this diagram, even if the king is directly not present. Firstly, it is not only dominant caste households which are able to attach other castes to themselves to a greater or lesser extent. Households in every caste will attempt to replicate this pattern by using their resources to employ members of other castes, or sometimes other usual castes, to perform various services for them, because services to sab koi ko chahiye. Now what happens when you can't afford any services? Then you are obviously dirt poor, then you are screwed. But in your village there will be someone or the other doing some service or the other for you. You can't do everything by yourself, can you? Unless you are a villager who is insanely poor, just does some kheti badi from morning to evening and goes to sleep, but sells his crops, maybe buys some alcohol, bidi, cigarette, etc., or does some puja in the local temple. Then who buys the samagris of the temple? Okay, someone has to produce the samagris of the pujas in the temple, okay? So economics is not going to completely be eliminated from this situation. Obviously, the greater one's resources, the greater will be one's capacity to do this. Okay, just exactly what we discussed, lol. But virtually no household is so poor that it cannot at least occasionally afford to retain others to perform a specialized ritual functions. At funerals, weddings, or caste initiation ceremonies, for example. Lol. Exactly what I was just talking about, that even if they are that poor, it will still go on. Nice. He just answered my question. Abhay is saying even some Hindutva folks believe in vertical caste system, otherwise they would not support reservation for OBCs or even SC/STs. I don't know how that works. Secondly, the model might give the impression that each caste is okay. Now he is saying that I did give a diagram. Now he debunked his own diagram, saying that it might be a little simplistic for this one reason. The other reason that diagram is a little simplistic is that this model might give the impression that each caste is an undifferentiated block when the reality is more complex. It's all ambiguous. It's all a tangle. It's a clusterfuck. Different lineages and different households within each lineage may vary substantially in their wealth, and this may have important ramifications in terms of internal status differentiations within the caste. Absolutely. These are all reasons why reservation makes no sense. For example, the formation of de facto subcastes is not uncommon when certain lineages attempt to set up more or less exclusive marriage circles within the caste and begin to call themselves by a particular name which sets them apart from their erstwhile caste fellows. Hitesh Ranjan Chanal's paper. Begin to call themselves by a particular name which sets them apart from their erstwhile caste fellows. Teli and Tili ka jo debate tha. Over time, these groups may become recognized by some as separate castes, even though their de jure claims to such status may be seen as rather shadowy by others. They may have fake genealogies. A number of other qualifications should be borne in mind when looking at the simplified model depiction in figure 1. Okay. For example, castes vary enormously in size. Typically, the largest castes are the dominant landholding groups and those who provide the bulk of the agricultural labor, while other castes providing specialist services are frequently very small. Right. While the members of most castes, because of their attachment to the land, will see themselves as belonging to one caste system only, other, particularly merchants, may well function in more than one community and may thereby attain a certain degree of autonomy from dominant landowning castes, merchants, the Vaishyas. It would be impossible to present a model which showed either the ideological or physical distances of different castes from the center meaning the king. Some castes or some lineages within certain castes, will legitimately claim to be nearer to the royal center, either in terms of their kinship pedigree, perhaps some among them have married into noble lineages, or in terms of the privileges they enjoy. The castes which supply the king's priests will undoubtedly claim higher status than the castes which supply the farmer's priests, obviously. Untouchables are frequently presented as being outside the community altogether and in fact must often live physically apart from other castes. This is because their primary function is to act as scapegoats and to take out pollution, that is, whatever threatens social order, to beyond the community's limits. Finally, it is also possible that there will be others somewhere in the vicinity, renouncers, independent sects, renouncers meaning sannyasis, members of other ethnic groups who cannot be accommodated easily within the local caste system. In spite of these qualifications, the underlying structure of the caste organization is as Hocart portrayed it. The central institution for comparative purposes, he claimed, is kinship, family, and its associated ritual. For Hocart, castes are essentially families or kul, which perform hereditary functions in order to ensure that the king and the nobles remain free from pollution. So, castes are families which perform hereditary functions in order to ensure that the king and nobles remain free from pollution. Whereas Dumont claims that the ideological pivot of caste is the priest's purity, Hocart argues that it is the purity of the king and the nobles. There is another more subtle but very significant difference between the two views which explains Hocart's reasoning. For Dumo, the priest is highest because he is pure. Yet, even if we were to restrict this claim to the realm of ideology, Hindu views concerning the purity of priests are extremely ambivalent. So, contradictory, dichotomous, mixed up again, like a clusterfuck. As one eminent Sanskritist has concluded, if a Brahman does not wish to compromise his purity, the one thing he must not do is function as a priest. Okay, listen to this. If a Brahman doesn't want to compromise his purity, the one thing he must not do is function as a priest. So, if you are a priest, you will compromise your purity. For Hokart, however, it is not that the king and nobles are pure, but that they should be pure because they provide a model for others. From this perspective, the priest is an instrument or vessel who facilitates the king's kingship, or the noble's nobility. He validates. He does the attestation like a bureaucrat, like a gazetted officer कि ये लो तुम ठीक हो, तुम अच्छे आदमी हो, और या फिर आज से तुम प्योर हो, और अब से तुम प्योर या फिर तुम्हारा घर प्योर है. For Hokart, however, it is not that the king and nobles are pure, but that they should be pure because they provide a model for others. From this perspective, the priest is an instrument or vessel who facilitates the king's kingship or the noble's nobility. Caste organization which requires some members of all non-noble lineages, okay? Caste organization which requires some members of all non-noble lineages to provide ritual services is a continual striving to make this possible. Where Dumo argues that the underlying structure of caste is in the ideology, I would argue that the ideological representations made by Hindus are irretrievably contradictory. The common structure underlying caste systems is rather to be found in constraints given by kinship. Constraints given by kinship on the one hand and kingship, okay, constraints given by family on the one hand and kingship on the other hand, both of which are set against a particular material backdrop, which allows a territorially limited kind of centralization to develop. The common structure of underlying caste systems is to be found in this. Constraints given by kinship on the other hand and kingship on the other hand. It is not only the historical experience of Nepal which beleaguers the claim of a growing number of scholars that caste emerged out of the colonial experience of India. The removal of Hindu kings in India heralded the superimposition of new forms of political authority and new forms of political association. But the traditional institutions of kingship on which caste organization depends have proved much more resilient and remain as they have been for centuries, encapsulated in the political and ritual centrality of dominant landowning castes. The traditional institutions of kingship on which caste organization depends have proved much more resilient and remain as they have been for centuries, encapsulated in the political and ritual centrality of dominant landowning castes. Here, it is partly the Western conception of kingship which is at fault, because it tends to characterize kingdoms as having a single monarch, जो कि है नहीं. हर जगह पे हर कोई राजा बनने का कोशिश करता है, राजा की तरह ही बिहेव करता है, राजा की तरह ही आसपास स्ट्रक्चर बनाता है, पॉलिटिकल स्ट्रक्चर बनाता है, पावर स्ट्रक्चर बनाता है. The traditional Hindu view has always been much more elastic, allowing for little kings and great kings as reflected in such epithets as Maharaja Dhiraj, great king of kings, which is still today the title of the king of Nepal. King of kings क्यों? इसका मतलब है कि you are a king who is the king of other kings. छत्रपति का मीनिंग भी तो ऐसा ही है ना शायद. Like Rai Shrestha. Rai means king. How are you the best among kings if there is only one king? Okay. So, hence the title Rai Shrestha, Bhuri Shrestha. No one has done more to elucidate the concept of little kings than Nicholas Dirks in his historical study of the former princely state of Pudukottai in the Tamil-speaking region of southern India. He argues convincingly that until the emergence of British colonial rule in southern India, the crown was not so hollow as it has generally been made out to be. Kings were not inferior to Brahmins. The political domain was not encompassed by a religious domain. Unfortunately, Dirks confuses representations of caste in the colonial and post-colonial periods, particularly those of Weber and Dumont, with caste as it actually was under British rule and has been since independence. Paraphrasing Dirks, one might say that even at the end of the 20th century, kingship, Rajawala, kingship in India is not as hollow as it is generally made out to be. Very well said. What a fucking great paper. Brilliant. Let's see if any important comments has come. Obsession with genealogy should go. ये तो और कुछ जाएगा भाई, ये नहीं जाएगा. ये आशा तुम छोड़ ही दो. Looks like we need I can't read the sentence here. It's people like him that have caused the downfall of Hindu Dharma in Bharat. Okay, thank you for joining the live stream, guys. This was fun. I'll try to come online again today. Bye bye.